choose all substance, what remains the mystical sectarian games.
All right, so it is May 1st, 2014, which is the new moon of the second month, which is Ziph. And so let's pray, and then we'll get into the study. Our Heavenly Family, again, here we are, placing ourselves before you, and we just want to serve you, and we want to be blessed by you as well, because we have known that we've been in a condition in which you really can't bless us to the fullest. So we come before you today knowing that it's a new moon and that you are offering us new fruit from the tree of life. And so we want to eat this new fruit, and we want to become what we eat. We want to be new and refreshed. And we know that this is the very reason why you've given us these times. So there's a just claim to your righteousness. So thank you so much, Heavenly Family. Thank you that you give us the love of a family. So guide us and guide me, help me to be able to explain these things as clear as can be and as loving as can be. Help your word and your truth and your love and your character to stand forth and shine brighter than ever, so that by beholding we can become changed and be made sons and daughters in your family. Thank you so much, Father, Mother, in the name of your two intercessors, the bridegroom and the bride, he and she, the branch. Amen. All right. So, there is the subject that we're going to be discussing is Ezekiel 4 in context, and there is a lot to this subject, and I am currently writing something on this because there's a need now, and the need won't end now either. I'm sure that there will be a number of people who want to know the biblical basis for the 430 years of Ezekiel as understood by Davidians and especially in the branch. And so kind of the basis for this discussion is that Ezekiel 4, it's this prophecy of Ezekiel. He's told to portray the city of Jerusalem on a tile. He is to lay siege against the city for 430 days, which it says represent 430 years, or each day for a year. And it is essentially one of the least understood prophecies that is still known to some extent. It's known among Adventists because we take from it the day for a year, or at least that's one of the places we take it from. But it is not understood even in Adventism, and there's very few interpretations of it. Among scholars, there are some who apply it to, some sort of historical fulfillment, but even when they do, they always leave it in the realm of the uncertain. And that is because there is no obvious historical fulfillment. there is no place where the things which are described in Ezekiel 4 clearly have met themselves, both in terms of the events and in terms of the dates themselves. So it is basically a rare thing that we find in Davidia and in the branch, that there's a detailed understanding of what that prophecy is talking about. However, just because there's a detailed understanding, it doesn't mean that it's the correct understanding or the correct application. And so because of that, the burden of proof is on Davidians and branches to be able to show why it is being applied as it is. And in other words, someone may ask, okay, is this just your interpretation of this text where you think it applies to this and therefore you impose your understanding on the text itself? That's called eisegesis. Exegesis is when the text itself is being understood. So as Davidians and branches, we have to address the issue. Is our understanding of Ezekiel 4 based off of eisegesis, us just putting an interpretation onto it, or is it actually exegesis? Is it actually something that's from the text itself that perhaps wasn't understood before but is now understood, but that it's the actual originally intended meaning of the Spirit in getting Ezekiel to pen down these words? So it's not necessarily that Ezekiel would have had to understand it for it to be its original meaning, but the Spirit would have had to have it as her original intent in having Ezekiel write it. And the reason why I make the distinction is because Daniel clearly didn't understand his prophecies, but there was an intent behind it. And that was the intent that the Spirit had in sending those messages through him. And so when we come to the original intent or the original meaning of the prophecies of Daniel, it's not necessarily what he understood it to mean, because he didn't understand it, but it's what it was originally intended to mean by the Spirit. So that's what we're wanting to do with Ezekiel, to see, is the understanding that came through Victor Hoddeth initially, and then later through Ben Roden and the branch messengers, is that something that is just being superimposed onto the text, or is that the original meaning? And so in the study that I'm writing, it's addressing that issue. And we won't be going through any of what I've actually written so far. What I've written so far is addressing what the study is about, kind of giving an introduction, and then giving a recap of the Davidian and branch understanding of Ezekiel 4. So I started with, okay, here's what Victor Hoddeth addresses, and then here's what Ben Roden addresses, and here's what Lois Roden addresses, and here's what Doug Mitchell addresses, and including their different contributions to the Davidian and branch understanding of this prophecy. And at the end, what we saw is that as far as the timing of this prophecy, there was many applications that were made. Victor Hoddeth made one application in one sense with a vague timing for the beginning and the end. Ben Roden made, I think, 3 different applications, and Lois had a chart with 8 or 9 different applications on it. And so there's been many applications, but what we saw is that Hoddeth pointed to the perfect fulfillment ending at the opening of the judgment for the living, investigative phase, in the church, that was the clear teaching of Ben Roden as well, that the primary application, Ben Roden, it was revealed to him that it was from 1525 to 1955. Lois Roden also maintained that, although she gave other applications. Doug Mitchell, his 3 main contributions to the study of the 430 years in the branch movement were the fulfillment of the final indirect application that Lois Roden made, which was from 1560 to 1990, starting from John Knox presenting his argument against the Mass, and ending with Doug presenting the Lord's Supper back to the table. Now, that's not what it's actually written, or that's not the actual title, but that was the purpose of it, to bring the Lord's Supper back to the table. That was the one contribution. The other was an understanding of the cow's dung mentioned in Ezekiel 4, I believe it's verse 15. And then the other is the most profound of the contributions that he made, which is the revelation of Ezekiel 5. And the reason why that is so profound is because Ezekiel 5 must necessarily only deal with the primary application of the 430 years. The reason why is because when we talk about a primary application, what we're referring to is the fulfillment of the text itself, where there is every factor taken into account. It must meet all the specifications, and it must be within the context of the chapter, or the verse, or whatever it may be. It must be in harmony with the surrounding context, as well as the context of the meaning that Ezekiel was referring to, the historical context, which is not necessarily a historical application, because the historical context may include it being a prophecy for the future, but the historical context, as well as the interscriptural context of what else does inspiration have to say on the topic. So it must fit all those different specifications. So Ezekiel 5 has to do with the passage context, the context within the passage itself. So it goes on, and you read Ezekiel 4, and there's this siege, then you get to Ezekiel 5, and then Ezekiel is told to shave his head, and when the days of the siege are fulfilled, he's supposed to start bringing these judgments. So that's what Ezekiel 5 is about. It's a natural continuation of Ezekiel 4 when reading the prophecy itself. So in that, what Doug really contributed was showing how Ezekiel 5 has been and is being fulfilled, and that the point at which it began to be fulfilled must be confirming to us the end point of the 430 years in its primary application. And as we have seen in the studies that we had during Unleavened Bread, Ezekiel 5 did begin to be fulfilled in 1955. That was when the first third part of hair was burned with fire in the midst of the city, in accordance with Ezekiel 5 verse 2. And so that is the primary application of Ezekiel 4 from 1525 to 1955. And we looked at the historical reasons for that as well, as far as Luther being beginning his Reformation in 1525 by marrying Catherine von Bora, a Catholic nun. And so that is the progression of this, and we have the studies available in the writings of Victor Houteff, Ben Roden, Lois Roden, Doug Mitchell, and also I wrote the study, The Judgment for the Living at the End of 430 Years, which addresses this whole subject in some detail. But all of that was mostly, all of those studies are mostly in the Davidian context. Doug Mitchell wrote his study, at least the parts of it in relation to Ezekiel 4, based off of what had already been understood in the branch message. Ben Roden, he wrote his information heavily relying upon Victor Houteff's statements. And Victor Houteff, he was the one that originally had the revelation of this, and he wrote of the subject in a few places in his writings, which was mostly for Adventists. But even then, there was only one place where he went into, you could say, a considerable amount of detail. But the question is, this prophecy, this message, we need to be able to we need to be able to establish this from Scripture and just show, okay, was Hadif right? Because we can't just say, well, this is the application, or this is the truth of it because Hadif said so, or because Ben Roden said so, or because Lois said so, or Doug said so, or I said so, or anyone. It can't be based off of a human being saying something. We have to see, is it established, or can it be established, that Victor Hadif was actually making scriptural connections? So it's important to get this broad view. And when we get this broad view, it opens up a lot more for us, which I believe is just being revealed. So some of what we're going to go into is, things that we are somewhat familiar with already, and other aspects are things that we have been less familiar with. And then there are other aspects which I'm sure won't be able to be gotten into today for one of two reasons. One is that there simply won't be enough time, and another is that it's not yet revealed, and that more is going to be understood on this. So first, what we want to do is see Victor Hadif. He talked about this as starting from the Reformation by Luther. That's what he referred to as being the beginning of the 430 years. I mean, why would he say something like this? Why would he get that application to begin with? So there's a few main principles that formed the foundation of why he was even approaching the subject as such. And the first that we're going to discuss is that Ezekiel's prophecies, period, that those prophecies are primarily for the last days. And one of the things that Hadif pointed to as showing that is that they haven't been understood. That these prophecies are among the most mysterious to remain in the most commonly accepted scripture canon. There are a few other books out there with prophecies that are just as peculiar, and maybe even more so to some degree, such as what we find in the book of Enoch. The book of Daniel has some strange stuff too, but we've gotten somewhat used to it. But Ezekiel is a little bit more on the fringe of, what would be considered normal prophecy. So because of that, Hadif talked about how in sects of Judaism, people weren't even allowed to study Ezekiel until they were at least, I forget if it was 30 or 33 years old, but it was in their 30s. They couldn't study Ezekiel. It was considered too high up for them. And this sort of idea still remains in Judaism, where people are told, oh, well, in order to really study Talmud, you have to first get a foundation in Torah and in Tanakh, and then if you're going to study Kabbalah, man, you have to be a master of Talmud first, And so the idea is that you kind of gain enough honor or enough wisdom in order to be able to comprehend these things. But are these things ever understood by the wisdom of men? Or are they by the revelation of the Spirit? So again, that's another citation for 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and Wisdom of Solomon chapter 9. So Ezekiel 1, it starts off with this cherubim, or this throne with 4 cherubim coming down. And we're going to look at that in a minute, but I just want to mention that's something that has been not very well understood. And because of that, Hadif pointed out, well, it hasn't been understood, and the reason why is because it wasn't for their time. Because whenever there is a need for something to be understood, the Spirit does reveal it. So that itself showed that the time to understand Ezekiel had not yet come. So those prophecies must be for the latter days, because they had not been revealed prior to the latter days. That's just one line of reasoning. Another is that a lot of these things have no easily recognizable historical fulfillment. And you can go through the whole book of Ezekiel and see that. You get to Ezekiel 5, and it's such symbolic actions of Ezekiel shaving his head and dividing the hair and doing certain things with different sections of his hair. What does all this mean? It's been a mystery. Ezekiel 8 and Ezekiel 9 describe abominations in Jerusalem, and Ezekiel 9 describes a destruction which again has no recognizable historical fulfillment. There are a couple things, some people say that it had to do with the Babylonians coming and destroying Jerusalem. There's reasons why that could not have been fulfilled at that time. And a few of the reasons are that other scriptures which refer back to Ezekiel point forward to its fulfillment even after Ezekiel's time. Another is that when the Babylonians came, the reason why they say that is because these men came from the way of the higher gate, which lieth towards the north, and Babylon was from the north. However, there was one man among them who was to put a mark upon the foreheads of all those that sigh and cry. Well, there's no record of that ever happening, and if the Babylonians were coming to destroy Jerusalem, why would they be marking or sealing these people? And the clear illusion in Ezekiel is referring back to something else that was supposed to be on our foreheads, which is in the Torah, which is the statutes, judgments, commandments. So these things, won't go into all the details on any one particular of these prophecies, but they clearly have not yet met fulfillment. You keep going through, you get to something like Ezekiel 17, and you have this parable of these eagles. Ezekiel 16 is actually contrary to history, because Sodom is actually not younger than Samaria, and the daughter of Jerusalem is not younger than Samaria. And Sodom certainly wasn't younger than the daughter of Jerusalem, but that's what these prophecies state. So it's actually contrary to the history, and that history, mind you, which Ezekiel himself well knew. So it's not like he could have made the mistake. He was very aware of these things. He was a priest. Scholars recognize that Ezekiel is one of the most literate writers of the Bible. He had such a vast terminology and very well-written Hebrew. So he could have very easily written the historical account of what happened to Sodom, Samaria, and Jerusalem. But there's something different there. And so people could see the Ezekiel 16 study to go through that. There's a number of other things which we won't get into, but Ezekiel contains a number of prophecies of the regathering of the 10-tribe kingdom and the uniting of that 10-tribe kingdom with the 2-tribe kingdom. This is in Ezekiel 36 and 37. And this clearly has never taken place, and all Jews know that it hasn't taken place. And so, and also Ezekiel 34, the prophecy of raising up the antitypical David, has clearly not been fulfilled in the past. And so these are things that's like, okay, you keep going through Ezekiel and there's more and more things that haven't been fulfilled. Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39, certainly never been fulfilled. And then the rest of Ezekiel is devoted to Ezekiel's temple, which there's absolutely no question has never been fulfilled. So Hodif, in having this view of Ezekiel, is seeing that, okay, these things have not been fulfilled. And if Ezekiel is a true prophet, then they must be fulfilled. And since the prophecies themselves necessitate their fulfillment within probationary time, or within a time that people can still choose and are still choosing salvation, that it must be fulfilled in the last days, which Ezekiel 38 actually says very clearly. Ezekiel 38 verse 16 says, "And it shall be in the latter days," etc., etc., etc. So all these things in Ezekiel are tied together. There are themes which go through the entire book, you see at the very beginning this cherubim coming down with the, and it's clearly a representation of the Shekinah. That same thing shows up again in chapter 10, and it shows up again in chapter 43, entering into Ezekiel's temple. These are things that are throughout the entire book. So, and it's all about restoration, is what we could say is the main theme. Now, that's one aspect. Now, Hadaf didn't understand all of what we just talked about when he first wrote on Ezekiel. He didn't know about the establishment of the kingdom in the last days, the regathering of the tribes and all that. But what he did know is that these prophecies are for the latter days. So it would make sense then that Ezekiel 4 at least has the potential of being for the latter days, that it wasn't fulfilled in antiquity. Now, another primary thing that Hadaf did understand is he saw that there was a connection between Ezekiel 1 and Revelation 4. So we're going to have a picture up here. And this is a picture that Davidians are familiar with. This is the cover of Tract 1, the pre-11th hour extra, formerly known as the Dardanelles of the Bible. And here we have a representation, an imperfect representation, mind you. There are aspects of this which are missing, certainly, but it shows the basic picture of what Ezekiel saw in chapter 1. And so we want to come to an understanding of what this is about. And the reason why is because when Ezekiel was told to portray a city and to portray Jerusalem, on a tile and to lay siege against it, the one that told him to do that was the one riding this throne. This throne came down, and then when you get to the beginning of Ezekiel 2, the one riding the throne starts talking to him in Ezekiel chapter 2 and Ezekiel chapter 3. Then Ezekiel chapter 4, that same one on the throne says to him to portray Jerusalem upon a tile. So Ezekiel 4 is actually part of the vision of Ezekiel 1. It's all interconnected. It necessarily has to be in context. So this is what we want to come to understand. So first, notice that there is a cloud, a fiery cloud that comes down from heaven to the earth. And that there are these 4 cherubim, each with 4 wings. 2 wings of each are covering their bodies. 2 wings of each are outspread to touch the wings of the other. They have 4 faces: the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an eagle, and the face of an ox. Those are the 4 faces. So they each have these 4 faces. There are wheels within wheels, and the wheels are covered in eyes, and the bodies of these cherubim are covered in eyes. And above them, one of the things that Hadaf left out of this picture is that above them was a platform or a dome upon which sat a throne, and on the throne was the likeness of a human. And that's important to pay attention to as well. And this one riding the throne is referred to in the scriptures, and this is gone through in the literature that we have. The first volume, it's volume 1, numbers 1 and 2 of a series called Divine Plurality. And yes, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. This here, we just mentioned how there was this dome or platform which was above these cherubim, and that upon that rested this throne, and on the throne was one which looked like a human. And that one in the scriptures, and this is recorded in Divine Plurality, Volume 1, Numbers 1 and 2, it's recorded that that being is referred to as Ruach, or Spirit, Yahweh, Shaddai, and the Glory. So all those terms are terms which are used for the Shekinah. And that's emphasized by the fact that the Shekinah dwelt between cherubim, and here is a Yahweh on the throne, and the throne is a cherubim throne. This is made all the more clear in Ezekiel 43, when this very throne, this very cherubim rider, goes into the temple to dwell there. So it's very clearly the Shekinah. So what we have here is something which Hadaf referred to, and he explained some aspects of this, but he didn't really explain a whole lot of the actual symbolism. All he said is that what this represents when this throne comes down is that it's coming down for the investigative judgment of the living. Well, why did he say that? What does any of this have to do with the investigative judgment for the living? Well, the reason why he made that connection is because of what is contained in Revelation chapters 4 and 5 and following. So if you want to go to the next picture now. This is what we see in Revelation 4 and 5. Yes, we have these 4 living creatures. This time, rather than having 4 wings, they have 6 wings, but they are all covered in eyes, and they have these same 4 faces: a lion, a calf or an ox, a man, and an eagle. So Hadaf here was seeing this clear connection, and it's one that's really easy to spot, and in fact hard to miss. If you were to read Ezekiel and Revelation back to back, you'd see it right away. Now here it's very clearly a judgment scene in Revelation 4 and 5, right? You have the one riding the throne with the book, you have these 24 elders, and you have a lion, a calf, the man, the eagle. These beasts, they have to play some role in this, and then you have the Lamb standing on the sea of glass. So, and of course there's the candlestick, which clearly shows it as being in the sanctuary. Now we won't be able to go through all the reasons right now, and most of you here are already familiar with this, but Hadaf pointed out that Revelation 4:1, and he actually has it right here, that which was to be hereafter. Hadaf made an emphasis of this. The reason why is because who knows when John, or when the Revelation was written? 1896. Yeah, 1896 or 95, right around in there. Now, when did Christ ascend into heaven? 31 AD 31. So, the common interpretation of this is that this is talking about Christ showing up in heaven again. Well, one of the issues is that Revelation 4 verse 1 says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet, talking with me, which said, Come up hither, and I will show you things which must be hereafter." So, here John is having this revelation of something which was to be hereafter, not 30 years before. So Hadaf was pointing out, okay, well, there was certainly a door opened in heaven when Christ ascended, and that was the door into the holy place, right?
60 years before, right?
Yes, sorry, 60 years before, thank you. Yeah, so when Christ ascended, in 31 AD, he entered into the sanctuary, is what we're told in Hebrews 8 and 9. And we won't go into all the details of that as to why Hebrews 8 and 9 does not say he entered the most holy place, but simply says that he entered the holy place and the sanctuary. Those are the two terms that are used. Now, and this must be the case as well, because when Christ ascended, what time of year was it? It was during Passover, the first time, right? And then it was 10 days before Pentecost when he ascended after the 40 days. That is not the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is the only time in which the high priest can enter into the most holy place. So this could not have been done in 31 AD, and it's not what the scriptures teach anyways. So there was to come a time, though, when this would happen. And there must be another door that is opened in order for Christ to enter in. So Hoddeth showed how this sanctuary judgment is the judgment of the Day of Atonement in Revelation 4. And that on the Day of Atonement, what actually happened is that the veil between the two apartments was lifted, and the two apartments became one for the day. And this is significant. The reason why some people would say that it's just the holy place is because there was the candlestick or the menorah. And that was in the holy place. It wasn't in the most holy. But on the Day of Atonement, the high priest actually was moving back and forth between what is typically the holy place and the most holy place, as well as even leaving the sanctuary. This happened on the Day of Atonement, so they had the veil lifted for the whole day. Now, this, another connection that Hoddeth made is that the clearest prophecy of the Day of Atonement beginning is Daniel chapter 8, the 2300 days. And Daniel chapter 8 is actually based off of, or I won't say based off, but I'll say it's building upon Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, it talks about the judgment opening, and it talks about one like the Son of Man actually standing before the Ancient of Days. We see the same thing here in Revelation 4, where we have the one sitting on the throne, which is the Ancient of Days, and the Lamb, which is clearly a symbol of Christ, standing before him. Now, the Son of Man in Daniel 7 was also clearly a symbol of Christ, because Christ himself claimed the title Son of Man, and we know it's not just a regular Son of Man like Ezekiel, because he's called the Son of Man as well. We know it's not a regular Son of Man because this one was a cloud rider, one riding on the clouds. And it has been observed by multiple scholars that the one riding on the cloud in the ancient world was clearly a term that was used for Baal. And it was always a divine term. It wasn't a term for humans to ride on a cloud. So this Son of Man was something else. But by his very name, Son of Man, he was shown to be human. But we have here someone who is human and divine, a cloud rider and a Son of Man. So this is Daniel 7, and the book of Enoch also clearly talks about this subject of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, and Christ made clear allusions to that. So, all this is showing, okay, here we have the investigative judgment. And we have these four faces. So Hoddeth was saying, okay, here's clearly the investigative judgment. In Ezekiel 1, we have these same four faces. It's clearly a throne. There's clearly judgment happening. Therefore, when it extends to earth, it's talking about the opening of the investigative judgment for the living, because a warning was sounded for the living. The judgments which succeed this in Revelation 1 clearly take place upon the living. Ezekiel 9 has to do with living people. Ezekiel 5 and Ezekiel 6 and Ezekiel 7, They all have to do with living people. It's not just a review of records. It's not just going through books. And in fact, there's not even mention of books in those chapters, like there is in Daniel 7 and in Revelation 4, which are both clearly scenes in heaven. So when we look at that, we can see how Hodov came to the conclusion that since Daniel 7 and Revelation 4 and 5 refer to the investigative judgment in heaven and are going over records for the dead, that Ezekiel must be referring to the investigative judgment for the living upon the earth. So this is why he made this connection. But we need to understand that that could not have been what was in Ezekiel's mind or what he understood, because Daniel wasn't written yet. Revelation wasn't written yet. It actually happened in reverse order for them. It so happened that what Daniel wrote was building on the things that Ezekiel wrote. And what John wrote for the Revelation was building on the things that Ezekiel and Daniel wrote. Yeah, you can see how that's exactly, that's the building of it. So, in other words, there must be something. In order for John to include these symbols in Revelation, there must be something inherent in the symbolism itself which shows the judgment. Not just something that by connecting these passages, it's the judgment. Because then one could say, well, you're saying that Ezekiel has to do with the judgment because Daniel and Revelation have to do with the judgment. But Daniel and Revelation only connected these things with the judgment because Ezekiel said so. Because Ezekiel had these things. So we need to look and see what these symbols themselves are referring to, and the context for them, to see why they are being portrayed in the judgment. Now, there are more connections between both Daniel and Revelation with Ezekiel to show that he was building upon this. Many people overlook the fact that in Daniel 7, the throne upon which the Ancient of Days sits actually has wheels. It is also a traveling throne, which is important to pay attention to. Many times we're used to thinking of it as a stationary throne, which in one place it is once it's made stationary, which is what happens in Daniel 7. But the way it became stationary, or the way it got to that place, was moving there on its wheels. And Ellen White actually had a vision of this, where she saw the Father move into the most holy place. And then the Son followed, moving into the most holy place. Right? So
not moving from getting up from one throne and then sitting on another throne, but an actually moving with the throne.
The way it's portrayed in Daniel is that it is a moving throne. Yeah.
We knew that there's 4 thrones, 2 stationary and 2 mobile.
Yeah, and there's actually at least one other throne as well, which is the throne, well, in one sense it's one other throne, the throne of David in the kingdom upon which Christ sits. So there are these different thrones, and there's a connection between what takes place here and what takes place in Ezekiel. Here you have 24 elders. In Ezekiel, the judgment upon in Ezekiel 9 starts with the ancient men, which are before the house. Now this, it's an imagery, but this is actually a different portrayal, because here these are being as righteous judges in Revelation 4, whereas in Ezekiel they were being as false judges under condemnation. Ezekiel chapter 8 talks about the 25 men which were before the house, which was the high priest and the 24 priests in their round. So there's all these connections between these passages. So we need to go back and see, what is Ezekiel talking about?
Would you see 25 there also being represented? Like you have the 24 elders and then the lamb, or the one sitting on the throne?
It would be the lamb. It would be the lamb,
So
yeah.
that would be your 25 there, right?
Yeah, and there's actually a rainbow about this throne in Revelation 4 as well, which was a symbol of the Shekinah. So there's the Shekinah, but we understand that in heaven, the Father doesn't sit on his throne by himself. It's the Father and the Mother, which she is actually represented by this rainbow in Revelation 4 and 5, showing them both there at the throne. So that's mirrored in the earthly with the rainbow and so on and so forth. So what we want to do now is go back and see what was being referred to in Ezekiel's prophecy. And then we can get an understanding of what these were building on. But again, our primary intent is to see what Ezekiel was referring to. But doubtless, since Revelation and Daniel were building on it, it will expand our understanding of both of these prophecies as well. So you can go to the next slide, and I'll explain what these things are. What we're going to look at now is a series of pictures and I'll give you the reference for what book this is taken from. It's taken from a book called Visions of Yahweh and Seal Art, a new interpretation of the majestic portrayals in Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1 and 10, and Zechariah 4 by Othmar Kiel. And he's a German scholar, and Germans are at the top of scholarship, by the way, in biblical scholarship. They're a few years ahead of everyone else, interestingly enough. And so this book is in German, and I don't think it's translated into English. But what all these are all illustrations of iconography found by archaeologists in ancient Babylon. And these all have to do with cherubim and thrones. And the reason why we're looking at this is because Ezekiel, where was he when he had this vision? Yeah, the river of Chebar in Babylon. They were in the captivity, which, by the way, is another reason why Hodov applied it as he did, because the captivity that Ezekiel was in was the one after the destruction of Solomon's temple. Hodov showed how Solomon's temple was a type for the early church, Christ himself representing Solomon, and that destruction of the early church and the falling away brought on the Babylon of the Dark Ages. And it was during that time that the Ezekiel 4 prophecy was to be fulfilled. So you see the typology. Ezekiel was given this revelation while in this Babylonian captivity, and the fulfillment of it was to be in the antitypical Babylonian captivity. So this is just another one of the things that Hodov had floating around in his head as to why. And I don't remember any place where he specifically explains that, but we can see that from his teachings, that is one of the background things here. So what we see here is a four-faced deity, and you obviously can only see three faces here, but it's just, some of these symbols or some of these pictures you'll see bear some resemblance with certain parts of Ezekiel 1, and others bear multiple aspects of resemblance. So you can go to the next picture. All right, so here we have these four-winged cherubim, and notice their feet as well. Feet as calves. That's what was also in Ezekiel 1 and Ezekiel 10, of course. And they're lifting up, it says winged bullmen as sky bearers. And they're bearing up this other entity. So you can see
a different rendition of Ezekiel 1.
Well, it's just similar iconography.
Okay.
These same symbols were found in Babylon, and they weren't always together, right? So these things preceded Ezekiel's vision, by the way. Ezekiel's vision wasn't the original. These things preceded it. So you can go to the next one. All right, this one's a little harder to see, but what this is a throne. This is the back where, you know, you'd rest your back. And then here is the platform. Here are the feet. Hello. And these here are cherubim holding up the platform upon which the throne sits. And you could kind of see that they have 4 wings. You have these ones here and the wings going down. And then they have tails. And it's hard to see their faces to see what kind of animals they are. But it's clearly it's a cherubim throne. So you can go to the next one. Okay, this as well is another, it's a circular throne, and it has these, it's kind of joined together, this one almost sphinx looking, right? But you see this throne with these beings, and these here are actually supposed to be wings, although it's hard to see all of what would have been there because they're joined together into one. So you can go to the next. This one also is just the idea of the throne with beings holding up the throne or the platform upon which the one sits, and the feet being like calves' feet. You can go to next. Here's another one of holding it up, and there's different wings, different faces, you know, with a beak like eagle, like a man. This, it's hard to see what it is. More likely a calf because of the horns, and this one is like a lion. So you have these different representations.
You've got all 4 represented. You got the
Yeah.
human face in the middle.
Yeah.
The top one's the lion. The second one down is the ox or the cow, and the bottom one is the eagle.
Yeah.
So I'm just a little bit. So these are images from Babylon.
From Babylon. Yeah.
Even prior to Ezekiel having.
Yeah.
So this was common iconography, you know,
Yes.
in Babylon.
Yeah. This was common iconography in Babylon, that any Babylonian, if they saw Ezekiel's vision, would have known kind of what it's about. You know, they would have had some sort of frame of reference for these things, because all of these symbols were common to them. So,
Are you familiar with the frame of the interpretation they would have made?
well, that's what we're going to get into. So,
Would this
yeah.
be common also in Assyrian, in Egyptian, and Phoenician?
Certain elements of it in the broader Mesopotamian cultures, it would have certainly been
So the
familiar.
ancient Near East context. And
Yeah.
In
But-
terms of their lifting of their gods, right?
Yeah, yeah, and actually, what we're going to get into shows that the roots of these things actually do go back to ancient Babylon, though, so far as is able to be traced. So you can go to the next one. Okay, here's a similar thing as well. We have these thrones with wheels is the primary focus of this, and of course you have this. You can see how this being has 4 wings. It's kind of hard to see 100%. And I don't know what all the iconography here is about and what it's trying to symbolize.
Lifting
But-
up the arms.
Yeah, lifting up the arms, and
Woman
not
riding
sure
a
what
beast.
this beast is doing and what this thing is all about here, but the basic, you can see the similarity with the wheeled chariot throne. So you can continue on.
Almost similar to Revelation 17:18, with the woman riding a beast.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That is similar.
And there is that thing that we studied in the Hebrew roots movement where that it was common for kings to be born around,
Yeah.
so that the bearers became the wheels essentially
Right.
of the throne on which
Yeah.
the king sat.
Yeah, that took place, or they would have it so that it would be on wheels and there would be those moving it around. So you'd have the wheels and those moving it just so they don't have to hold it up all day. But
So in its basics, it would have at least conveyed that here was the appearance of a kingly being.
yes, a king or god. And what all of these are is thrones of kings and gods in Babylon. So you can go to the next one.
Which at that culture they would have considered the kings or the queens to be gods.
Yeah.
They were worshiping
Yeah.
them as gods.
Some of them they viewed as the gods themselves or as being kind of like the indwelling of the god. So here, this one, you see some more similarities where you see the eyes all over. You have the 2 sets of wings, so the 4 wings. And, this one's a little bit more graphic, I suppose. But it shows this imagery. And not sure what's going on with the head, if it's supposed to be representations of multiple faces or just some crazy...
Bad hair day.
Yeah, bad hair day or crazy hairdo or some sort of hat, something like that. So you can go to the next one. Now this one you've all seen before because it's in this book, The Divine Plurality, Volume 1, Numbers 1 and 2. And what we see here is that this one is the most similar to what we read in Ezekiel. Because notice how it comes down into one leg that's like hooves of a calf. Comes down into one leg, which is what's in Ezekiel. They have 4 wings, and 2 wings are covering their bodies. 2 wings are stretched out, meeting each other in the middle. They have the wheels by them, and they have 4 faces. And here it's actually the same 4 faces of the man, the lion, the eagle, and the ox. And they're holding above them this platform. So this is, this clear parallel to what is in Ezekiel. Now,
Again, this is another Babylonian throne.
yes, this is a Babylonian throne. So, before getting into this, one thing that this tells us, what Ezekiel saw, if he was to see this walking around in Babylon, who do you suppose would be on the throne?
A king.
A king or,
The god.
yeah, it would be Baal, or, it would be the king, or it would be the Babylonian head god, the head god of Babylon.
Nebuchadnezzar would have rode on a...
Possibly. I don't know of any particular thing that states that he did, but it was part of their culture, so it wouldn't be surprising at all. So, but who did Ezekiel see riding this same thing? Yahweh, right? Ezekiel saw Yahweh riding this. So who's the true king of Babylon? Yahweh, right? He's showing, hey, look, and we know this anyways, that's what Yahweh had to teach Nebuchadnezzar, right? I'm actually the king of Babylon, That's what he had to teach him, right? So that's one lesson that we can get from this, which is important. And this, I just want to mention as a side note, Ben Roden, not knowing this, taught just based off typology that the king of Babylon in antitype is Yahweh, the true king of Babylon. And this just confirms his teaching on that. And it's not in every application, because obviously a king of Babylon doing wickedness is not portraying Yahweh. But there are definitely certain things where they were told, listen to the king of Babylon. Listen to Nebuchadnezzar. He is my servant. He is, going on that line of things. So here, Ezekiel was being shown that Yahweh is the true king of Babylon. Now there is I want to just make a little note to keep in mind for later. One of the things that this is letting you know is that what is being portrayed is that Yahweh, the king of Jerusalem, is having some sort of relationship or is displacing in some way the head god or the king of Babylon, right? So there's some interrelation. Now, Ezekiel, when he had this vision, he actually was seeing it at a time when the leadership of Jerusalem was in apostasy, and that's why they had to go into captivity. So there's a intermingling between Jerusalem and Babylon, and that carries multiple connotations with it. But one of the reasons why this is important is because the siege that is being laid in Ezekiel 4 is not against a Jerusalem in good standing with Yahweh. It is against a Jerusalem in apostasy that has become captive in and amalgamated with Babylon. Now, if you understand what Hodif said about the siege of the 430 years, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because Jerusalem, according to Hodif's interpretation, was not any good entity in those 430 years. Now, that has a basis to it in this. That has a real basis to it. Now, what we're going to do here is, you can go to the next image now, and this is just another representation of a being with these different elements of, a man, an eagle, a calf, and the tail is very lion-like. And so we have these beings all put together, and this was another type of cherubim in Babylon. Now there's a story behind what this represents, both to the nations and to Israel. And that is the significant thing to pay attention to here. You can go to the next image, and this is going to help us to understand. Yes?
I just wanted to mention that idea that Yahweh was the true king of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar his servant.
Right.
That underscores what we believe about anti-typical David.
Yes, to
There's
some
a
degree it certainly
a
does.
visible authority and an invisible authority.
Yeah. Certainly true. So here what we have is in the center another representation of a cherubim made up of these different beings. Well, this is the ancient zodiac, and which the earliest record that we have goes back to Babylon. It's Babylonian zodiac. And the 4 cardinal points on the zodiac was that of a man, an ox, a lion, and an eagle. And the eagle actually had a serpent clutched between its claws or in its mouth, and there's different ways of illustrating it. And that is, in later versions, it was shown as Scorpio, but it actually has an eagle behind it, right? And so it's this eagle grabbing a serpent. And later, that with other things that we may or may not get into in this study, that is very relevant. So what we have here is, okay, we have this zodiac, and so it's showing these constellations, right? And these 4 faces were encompassing the 4 cardinal points of the zodiac. Why is that significant? Why would that have anything to do with what Ezekiel was talking about? Why were the Babylonians even talking about that? In Ezekiel, remember, there was a platform above the cherubim's head, right? Or a dome. In King James, it says firmament. It's the same word that's used in the creation story for this dome. And upon this dome were fixed these stars and the constellations, or upon the dome of the sky. The Israelites, we talked about it before, how as far as they understood, the sky was a solid dome, and that the sun, moon, and stars were all in this solid dome. And these beings, just to give a little bit broader picture of this, they were all full of eyes, right? The wheels, these turning wheels are showing these cycles, right? The eyes on them, Ezekiel uses terms that are talking about them shining. The word that he uses for shining is actually a different form of the word for eyes. So the eyes, them being full of eyes, the eyes are representing the stars. These beings are inside of this dome, which is like the sky, and they have these faces, which are these 4 points of the zodiac. So they're representing these stars, and what do these stars represent? What did the ancient world view these things to be? And we can go and we're going to look at this to give us a far better understanding. Tim?
Were they in conjunction with the Tekufas, like the four on the her earths, like those?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you had the 12 stars. So then you would have the spring and the fall equinox and the spring and the summer.
Yeah, these were the ones in conjunction. I think that these were the equinoxes and these were the solstices, if I remember correctly. But it's, that was all in connection with this. And so this is what Ezekiel saw. The one clear thing is Yahweh is the true king of Babylon. But there's also the Babylonian iconography, which formed a basis for this. And it wasn't just Babylonian. It was all the ancient Near East. And the Israelites had certain things that they understood about the stars as well, and what they represented to the Israelites. And so we're going to look at a few passages to make that aspect clear to us. And it'll bring us a better view of what's going on in Ezekiel 1. The first is Deuteronomy chapter 4. We've talked about some of these aspects previously. Deuteronomy chapter 4.
So these animals are the same as the four faces on the four sides of the throne?
Yeah.
Right in the vision, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Revelation 4 and 5 and Ezekiel 1.
I think the ancient Israel camp, like the camp of the Israelites, I think, from what I understand, it was the same.
The tribal.
It was.
Yeah.
And that's one of the aspects that we're going to get into, because it's significant in relation to this as well.
In relation to the judgment,
Yeah.
There's something unfolding there, yeah.
Something unfolding for sure. So, we have Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 19 and 20. This is what it says. And lest thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun, the moon, and the stars, even all the hosts of heaven, should be driven to worship them and serve them, which Yahweh thy God hath divided unto all nations under the whole heaven. But the Lord hath taken you and brought you up, or brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance, as they are this day. So as ye are this day. So according to this, who did he divide the nations unto?
The hosts of heaven, the sun, moon, and stars.
Yeah, unto the hosts of heaven, the stars of heaven. Now, in Deuteronomy 32, same book, verses 8 and 9, let's see who he divided the nations unto. Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9. When the Most High divided the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Is one way of reading it. Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Septuagint, it reads according to the number of the sons of Elohim, the sons of God. This is significant because that's different than what we see in the Masoretic text, the children of Israel. How many nations were there? There were 70, right? But the children of Jacob were 12. And not only that, but when he divided the nations, Israel didn't even exist yet. So either way, how could he divide it according to their number when they didn't even exist? In all the ancient Mesopotamian literature, they talked about these sons of God and how the number of the sons of God was 70. It's not a coincidence. They understood there to be 70 sons of God. So when the nations were divided, they were divided according to their number, which was the number of these hosts of heaven. Now, there's more on this that will help us to understand that. You had something else to say?
So we're tying in the wicked gods here.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yeah, this has to do with the wicked gods.
Even the thrones, their thrones.
Yes. Yes. The Babylonian thrones, just to give you kind of like, just to state it, what it means, then we're going to look at a few more scriptures. These cherubim, these four faces, and these beings covered in eyes, they were representations of that divine council, of those gods. And that the head god is the one that sat on top. That's where Baal sat when he was the head god.
That's why the connection to what John saw in the Revelation.
Yeah.
Chapters 4 and 5.
And that we'll get into why that relates.
So that's where they are shown being judged.
That's part of it.
In Revelation 4 and 5, because they're there present in the judgment, so the throning of those wicked gods.
That is part of that judgment.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's more than that too. It's broader, but that's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
And so here we have represented here those wicked gods. They are part of this in judgment. Now, to expand on this a little bit, we know just a few other verses that will make this connection. We all know in Job, chapters 1 and 2, it talks about, time came, and actually we'll just read these passages. Job 1 verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan came also among them. And it talks about how Satan came from going to and fro among the earth, which is implying that where they met was not the earth, right? Meaning somewhere else. And it's the sons of God. I believe it was Ellen White who pointed out that these sons of God are what might be called the Adams of the other worlds. Adam, when you read it in Luke, the genealogies, it goes back, son of, son of, son of, son of, and Adam, the son of God, right? Now, he wasn't a son by being begotten, he was a son by creation. And that's what these other sons of God are too. And there's specific passages where Yahweh specifically states that he created these sons. Okay, so they are clearly created beings. They are not another sort of being.
This gathering time would also be a moed time for the sons of God.
Yeah.
Most likely in connection with the festival system on earth.
Whether it is in connection with the festival system on earth or not, I don't know, but they're clearly appointed times.
Stephen's told us some things on that before.
Yeah.
It was that council that Lucifer really wanted to take over.
Yeah. Oh, when he talks about, in Isaiah 14, he talks about ascending above the stars of God. That's what he's talking about. Isaiah, let me just get the verse on that quick. It is Isaiah 14, speaking to Lucifer or Hillel, it says, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God."
Which verse?
Verse 13, sorry. Isaiah 14, verse 13. "Set my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north." So the mount of the congregation or the council. Yeah. So, and it's the mount also of the divine council. They are the congregation. They are this host. And so it's, here we see this thing where these stars are representative of that council. And there is a number of places where a star can represent a child. And Doug went through that in the four horns of the altars of the sanctuary, which is why these stars are equated with the sons of God. So, Job chapter 2 now, verse 1, again states, "Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan came also among them to present himself before Yahweh." So it's the same sort of deal. Now, continuing in Job, by the time we get to chapter 32, or not 32, it's 38. 38 verse 7 says, "When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Right? So there's this connection, the morning stars and the sons of God, Hebrew parallelism. So these things are all being connected. There's a few others that we will actually take the time to read because it makes it so very clear. In Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 2, this is what it says. "And they shall spread them before the sun and the moon and all the host of heaven, whom they have loved, and whom they have served, and after whom they have walked, and whom they have sought, and whom they have worshipped. They shall not be gathered nor buried, they shall be for dung upon the face of the earth." So notice, here they are going after the hosts of heaven, right? The stars, and they are worshiping them. And who were they worshiping? They were worshiping these wicked gods, right? And the scriptures tell us that they were worshiping Asherah and Baal and Molech and all these different gods. In Jeremiah chapter 19, verse 13, it says, "And the houses of Jerusalem and the houses of the kings of Judah shall be defiled as the places of Tophet, because of all the houses upon whose roofs they have burned incense unto all the host of heaven, and have poured out drink offerings unto other gods." That one's really specific, right? Very, very clear. So there are a number of things which bring this together. In 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 19, it's a really clear image of this council, the heavenly council. And you have the judge sitting there with the host of heaven around him. Those are these sons of God. There's other examples, but that should be sufficient to make this connection. So here, yes?
So the sons of God are the wicked gods?
Yeah. Now, not in every context are they the wicked gods, but they are this divine council. And some of them are clearly said to be wicked, that they have fallen, So there's, in Job, it doesn't really imply that all of them are wicked, It kind of is a different picture.
Yeah.
When you read it in 1 Kings 22, it's very clear that some are wicked and some are righteous, because there is disagreement among them. It says, one spake on this wise and one spake on this wise. And they were arguing about what to do in this situation of Jehoshaphat. And so then at the end, the council decided that they would send forth a lying spirit. Now, lots of people read that and think, whoa, Yahweh's trying to deceive us. No, Yahweh's not trying to deceive us. It's just that the council is composed of righteous and wicked, and that sometimes it is seen that the fair thing to do is to allow the devil to do whatever his plans are, like we saw in Job. Okay, you can go, right? Okay, you can go and do this. Then he comes back. Okay, you can go and do this. So what was decided in the divine council in 1 Kings 22 is that a lying spirit could go forth and was therefore sent from the council. But it's not that Yahweh sent the lying spirit. It's that the council did.
It wouldn't come down to a vote of majority, would it?
I don't know if it came down to a vote of majority or whatever it was. I'm not sure. That's something to look into, and the scriptures may have something to tell us in that regard. Who knows?
Yeah.
But all that I can say is that there are times where it is seen to be the fair or appropriate or just thing for the enemy and the wicked gods to be able to do something that they want to do. And clearly we see that that's the case because look at all the wickedness in the world.
Well, he used Nebuchadnezzar as his servant.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. He even used Nebuchadnezzar as a servant. So here, what we see that what Ezekiel saw was this idea. Go ahead, Lorna. That's fine.
It just flashed that, okay, in what context does he do that? Why? He says he will bring the Chaldeans
Right.
because of the necessity amongst his people to be judged or chastened.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it is definitely this chastening thing. You know, this has happened time and time again. The book of Judges bears that out clearly. And one of the greatest examples is with Babylon. So, there are a number of other aspects of where we can go from here. And I think that what we're going to do, I'll just quickly recap kind of that whole idea of what Ezekiel saw and what this throne represented. And I'm sure that there's more to it, and maybe that'll come out in the literature. But the basic picture in the Babylonian context is that the head god is there ruling and has all the wicked gods under him. And those were represented by the stars of heaven. But the stars of heaven, you know, the purpose of them and the constellations was showing forth these wicked gods. So what Ezekiel saw is that Yahweh was now the head god. Yahweh was sitting on the throne. So Yahweh was replacing or displacing Baal. Now there's another aspect of this, which is what you were mentioning, Derek, about Israel and how when they were camped around the tabernacle, they were in 4 main sectors. And those sectors had the tribes. You can go to the next image, actually. These were the sectors. And I'm not sure if all of these, I haven't looked into it to see if these different banners are actually the banners of those tribes. But
Yeah, they are. And then there's
they
one,
are.
like lead tribe on each side.
Yeah.
And then the lead tribe is those inner.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is I don't know, like, I haven't looked into whether or not Simeon is actually represented by a sword or if it's another symbol, something like that. I'm not sure. But if you've looked into it, maybe you know.
You're just saying you haven't verified the accuracy? Or
Yeah, I haven't verified the accuracy of these ones all around the edges. But these ones, Reuben as a man, Ephraim as a calf or an ox, Dan as an eagle, which was also connected with a serpent. And Dan was with a serpent. And that was in the constellations where you had the eagle with the serpent. And then the Lion of Judah is the most well-known.
I think also
Yeah.
maybe a better depiction would be is showing like Judah north, Ephraim south. It should really be their east and west. Right? Judah was in the east, Ephraim was in the
Right.
west, and Dan was in the north, and Reuben was in the south.
Right. And it depends on, well, yeah, this you'd have to switch those two at least. And it depends on if we're looking at this as being the west or the north.
Yeah.
But at some point, it'd be nice to have an illustration that really shows it with the points of the compass in view. But this, I just found this picture real quick just to show those 4 as being the 4 leading tribes or the closest tribes to the tabernacle and how they were represented by the same things. And what this is about is that just as Yahweh is displacing the high god on the council in the Babylonian picture of things, just so Israel is displacing the wicked gods on the council. And it's a beautiful thing. And so we're going to see here the connection here, because we have to remember to bring all this back into Ezekiel 4, because that's what we're looking at, right? So just keep that in context. And it might seem like we're going off on a detour, but really this is all part of the picture necessary in understanding why Ezekiel 4 is what it is and why Ezekiel 5 is what it is. So, Lorna?
How how is this related to that time when God's people had power over the nation? Is it related?
That would be the deliverance in the smaller villages here, in this Ellen White's vision
Yeah.
of the sword being raised and falling as straw, and then from that point the people had power over the nations.
Yeah, the way it connects with that, again, everyone going back to Psalm 82, let's keep that psalm in mind, because that is one of the most clear passages talking about this council of gods. And there, those council, actually I'm going to read it quick, it's not that long, and it just shows the whole thing so clearly.
And isn't it also tied into the reward of the faithful servant? Here's 10 cities, rule over them, right?
Right. Yeah, it's showing this thing, these parables of the kingdom, showing this rulership over the nations. And there are other studies in a Psalm chapter 2, for example, shows the re-inheritance of the nations by Yahweh, because we saw that they've been ruled by wicked gods. They have been the inheritance of the wicked gods for so long. But it's according to 11Q13, which is the Melchizedek scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Melchizedek is supposed to gain back the inheritance from these wicked gods. And when we understand what some of the New Testament says about Melchizedek, it makes a little bit of sense. So, Psalm 82. Elohim stands in the congregation of El. He judges among Elohim. Okay, so gods stand in the congregation of God, and among the gods does he judge. And then this is the judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and accept the persons of the wicked? Selah. Defend the poor and the fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Rid them out of the hand of the wicked. They know not, neither will they understand. They walk in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course. I have said you are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High, or B'nai El Elyon, which is sons of the Most High, or children, either way, but it's the same term, this sons of God thing. Sons of the Most High. But ye shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes. So that's the judgment. And then at the end, the writer of the psalm says, Arise, O Elohim, referring to the true, judge the earth, for thou shalt inherit all nations. Right?
Does it tie in right there to Revelation 4?
That does tie into Revelation 4 for sure, where these gods are part of that council, but it's also the gods that are in judgment, but it's also the people that are in judgment, because they are the rulers of the people, and it starts
With those gods.
Well, it starts with the gods and with the children of Israel, because they are the ones who are supposed to displace these gods. But how do they displace these gods?
So,
By
Yeah.
being born again.
Yeah.
so you can't displace those gods until you have somebody that can displace them.
Yeah.
You gotta judge or restore, resurrect the people,
Yeah.
justify them, and then you can judge those gods.
Yeah. Well, it all comes together. Lorna?
We heard that very call that Sabbath morning from a brother.
Mm.
Arise
Right.
and share the light you have.
Amen. Amen. Arise and share the light. Beautiful. So that right there, it's showing this whole thing of what Ezekiel saw, the purpose of it in Ezekiel 1 is to show that Yahweh gets victory over Baal and that Israel gets victory over the wicked gods and thus over the nations, right? So that is a huge deal, right? I mean, that's an encouragement for Ezekiel in Babylonian captivity, and that should be encouragement for us as well. That our heavenly family will come out on top and that we will displace them in the council. So there's some some passages that we want to go through to show how that the scriptures actually talk about how we displace the wicked gods. We actually join that heavenly council.
Now, is that the same as making up the third of the angels that fell?
In one sense, but there may be some distinguishing because the third of the angels may not be 100% equated with these wicked gods, right? Because there was this, the third, the way I'd put it is that it's very likely that the wicked gods are included in that third of the angels, but that they are not the entirety of them. Yeah. So, but they are very connected. I mean, even those angels are represented as stars, the stars of heaven. And there's no place that actually specifies that those stars are angels, other than the implication from Revelation 1, where the stars are said to be angels. So, we have this idea. Now, there's a lot of connections here, but one of the places that shows Israel, or the believers, as displacing these wicked gods is actually Daniel 8. And why would that be significant? What's Daniel 8 about?
Cleansing of the sanctuary.
The cleansing of the sanctuary, right? So, if God's people in Daniel 8 are represented as displacing the wicked gods, that's kind of a big deal, right? Because we see that Revelation 4 and 5 is describing the fulfillment of Daniel 8:14. And that Daniel 8:14 is parallel to Revelation, or to Daniel 7, 9 to 13, the judgment, and the Son of Man coming before the Ancient of Days, right? So there in Revelation 4 and 5 is where we saw this connection between these four faces, right? Which connects back to Ezekiel. Go ahead.
Could you repeat the last couple of sentences?
Sure. I'll repeat that. Yeah, no, that's good. I want Tim to be able to hear this too. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're going to look at some scriptures which show that God's people are to replace the wicked gods. And I was mentioning how the first one that we're going to look at is actually in Daniel 8. Then I asked, why would that be significant? What is Daniel 8 about? The investigative judgment, right? The cleansing.
2300 days. And
Yeah. The 2300 days, the cleansing of the sanctuary. Now, when we get to Revelation 4 and 5, just like we already talked about, that is the cleansing of the sanctuary. The investigative judgment, the end of the 2300 days, right? So there we see these images, right? We see in Revelation 4 and 5 those same four faces, right? And that is built off of Daniel 7 and Ezekiel 1. So Revelation 4 and 5 is talking about this displacement of the wicked gods, where, yeah, those four faces show those wicked gods, but it's Israel coming in their place, right? God's people replacing them. Now, that's significant because Daniel 8 is about that 2300 days. And if in there it's talking about this same thing, then it just really solidifies the connection between the one and the other. And did you have something to say?
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
So just for the linear thinking here, that the concept of the wicked gods was never really known before, thought even in branch understanding.
Yeah, that's correct.
So,
Yeah.
so that's just something that's new in the development under your message, the connection with the wicked gods, with
With Ezekiel and
these thrones and
yeah,
and the displacing of them, seeing how they have a part in this judgment of the living, of which then we are replacing.
right.
So we just had an increment in the understanding of the great controversy theme then.
Amen. Moving forward in understanding the great controversy, moving forward in understanding the judgment, and moving forward in understanding Ezekiel 4, and we're going to see how it connects in again.
And of our place in it. the high
Amen.
calling. that
Oh,
we are
yes.
called to.
Such a high calling, indeed. So, yes,
So who are the 70 rulers then?
they are the gods of the nations.
And who would they be?
They are you asking like their names? Because some of them are named in the Bible.
Oh, not necessarily. I just mean like, so are they fallen angels or?
Well, they are beings not from this earth who fell into wickedness, most likely with Lucifer, that he deceived them, and that they came down and put themselves forward as being rulers. Who they were before that fall, it's hard to say if they were of all of them were the atoms of other worlds, or if they were partly atoms of the other worlds, and because angels, they can be referred to as angels, but they're not just angels how we think of angels. They may be a variety of different types of beings. We just don't know for sure. It's just that there's nothing to specify them as one type of being. Yeah, they might not all be one type of being or whatever. It's hard to say for sure.
But I mean, didn't Ellen White pretty much make it clear that like ours was the only planet infected with sin?
That's what
Yeah.
I was gonna mention.
No, ours is the only planet infected with sin. Whether or not these other beings originally came from other planets is another story. But sin has never entered into their worlds. Sin has gone to heaven and originated in heaven, but it was never permitted to go to these other worlds. Whether it was at a gathering that these people were pulled aside, because it talks about gatherings from other worlds to this place called heaven. And if some of those beings were deceived by Lucifer and then came down to this earth, we don't know for sure. That's a possibility. But
Bottom line is, your answer is, we don't know the specifics of what
Yeah.
kind of created being these wicked gods are.
yeah, we don't
You're
know.
saying they're not even all wicked?
Well, no, the sons of God aren't all wicked, but in the context of heaven, but in the context of those ruling the nations of this earth, they are all wicked.
But you were saying something like in the council of God, there were some like moderate voices and some wicked voices.
Yeah.
So they're all consorting together.
Well, it's in 1 Kings 22 is where you can read that. And what it is that it is not just these gods from this world who are on that council. There's the Most High, who is the Father. There are other gods who may be from other worlds or wherever they come from, who are on this council, not just Ha-Satan, the devil, and not just these wicked gods. So there are those.
There's more than 70 on that council.
Don't know for sure. Don't know how many are on that initial council, or if all that, the thing that we know for sure is that there are 70 gods ruling the 70 nations of this world. And that those 70 are fallen, wicked gods.
And they're
That's what we
created
know.
beings, not gods does not mean
Yeah,
the self-existent one. It just means a mighty or lofty one.
exactly.
So not to be confused with Yahweh or a self-existent. Yeah, they were created just like they
Right.
were everything else.
So we knew from Ellen White that the plan of salvation was much more to behold by these other worlds.
Yes.
And then also at the cross there was a closing up in the minds of people who I guess probably representatives of this council.
Right.
That it's settled in their mind, because somehow before that they seemed to be somewhat questioning whether maybe there was some validity to the accusations that the Hasatan was making.
Right.
So it's only at the cross then that he is then it seems like they make a decision, and maybe some don't. Right?
Well, yeah, I'll put it like this. Psalm 82, it's clear that there are these gods on the council who are being judged, right? And that judgment, them falling and dying like men, and Yahweh inheriting the nations, is something yet future from today. So those gods are still on this council. Now, how that manifests, if they actually travel there or whatever, we don't know. We really don't.
Oh, so that takes, okay.
But they are still on the council. Yeah.
When you say the council now,
Yes.
I think I'm a bit confused. There are two councils?
Not
One of
necessarily.
God and one of the wicked ones?
No. No. There's not as...
You said there was one where they were all wicked.
Well, I'm saying, where I said that they're all wicked is when I was speaking in context of the gods who rule the nations of this world are all wicked. But they aren't the entirety of that council.
Okay.
Yeah.
One council of which there are 70 wicked ones, at least.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
got it.
Yeah. So
So there's a hierarchical system that we're looking to see.
there is a hierarchical system which is not yet fully understood, but if the book or books of Enoch are true, that may very well reveal more to us in regard to that.
So we're,
Mm.
okay. A judging of those 70 that are on ruling over this earth, but is there also a judging of those other, obviously some wicked gods at this other higher?
Well, I don't know if
Supreme
there
Court?
if there are wicked gods in this higher Supreme Court as distinct from the wicked gods of this earth. I don't know if that's true. You know what I mean? It would seem as though the only wicked gods are on this earth, but they are a part of that council, whether they go there and travel there. Clearly, in the Old Testament, it does describe them going there. In the New Testament, there's nothing specific one way or the other on that point. Go ahead.
Well, that is not so terribly strange because we understand that Adam was on that council,
Yeah.
became wicked or fell
Yeah.
from, or
Abdicated.
his authority was stolen by
Right.
Satan,
Yeah.
who then became a part of the
Oh,
council. So, we don't
Yeah.
want to say that God is directing wickedness on earth.
Right.
So
Right.
how would we say it?
How would we?
He's allowing
Free
for
will.
his own purposes.
Oh, yeah. Well,
It's
our-
kind of strange to think of him as ruling with a council that is partly wicked.
the way that it took place, looking at the history of it, is probably the clearest way to get that. And what it was, as recorded in Deuteronomy, is that when he divided the nations, is when he gave them to these gods. So the story behind it is that all these people, after the flood, people went back into wickedness and they started worshiping all these other gods. And so El Elyon, the Most High, the Father, said, okay, you guys want to worship these gods? Fine. But it's not going to be chaos in the sense of just like all this, like was at Babel, confusion. I'll divide these nations according to the number of these sons of God.
Keeps down their power too.
Yeah, keeps down their power. They're divided. And so now, in order to, what took place is he divided these 70 nations up to these 70 gods. And then what he did with Abraham is he said, okay, now I need a nation unto myself.
Oh,
So that is why there's even a nation.
okay.
You know,
Why there's the land,
yeah, that's why there's the land. That's why there's the nation. It's so important because otherwise people think that God is into some sort of nationalistic, racial thing. When it wasn't about that. It was about how he needed a people unto himself, and then he is part of this council, you know. You have this council where now they can meet and discuss the affairs of the earth. So,
That's
yeah.
why he could rightly, he had, in terms of the other gods, he had legal right to displace the Canaanites from the land and allowed, because under that allocation of land, at
Right.
the council level, you know, he wasn't doing anything that could be contested as being illegal.
Yeah, no, it was all within the legal parameters of the council law. And it was all, you know, it's significant. This territory thing has a lot to do with it. Even, I forget who it was, Naaman or someone, the guy who took part of the soil back from the land of Israel to his own ground, to his own land, so he could worship on that soil. Because he's like, well, this is Yahweh's soil. I'm going back into the dominion of my God, or the gods of the nations, and I'm going to bring some of this soil to show, hey, okay, this is my little embassy, you know. And so it's really...
So it was to show how this kingdom was to grow and then displace
Yeah.
the other kingdoms.
Yeah. And the way it gets displaced is what's described in Psalm 110, of thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. Because here's the thing, this is what it comes down to, of Israel displacing the wicked gods, right? This is what the plan was the whole way along. In looking at some of these passages now that describe this, it'll describe how we can be part of this displacement. And this is where it's most significant and where it ties into Ezekiel 4 and Ezekiel 5. And so this is, let's see, just looking at, yeah, we've been on here for a little while, but we want to try and just move forward and wrap it up. Daniel 8, verses 9 and 10. Now, these gods, these wicked gods, what were they called? We saw them called the hosts of heaven, right? The hosts of heaven, the stars of heaven, etc. Now, Daniel 8 is talking about the nations of the world. It talks about Medo-Persia in Greece, and there is a horn. There's 4 horns that come from Greece, and there's another horn that waxes exceeding great, which in Hodde's studies, we won't have time to go into it now, but he demonstrates quite clearly as that representing Rome. And then he talks about how what takes place in Daniel 7, or Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 and 10, what we're about to read, is parallel to the activity of the little horn in Daniel 7, trampling down the saints. Okay? We don't have time to go to all the details of making that connection, but most of you here are familiar with Hodde's studies on that anyways. So 9 and 10, verses 9 and 10 of Daniel 8.
I just want to clarify real quick, as I'm maybe a little daft here. You mentioned the great horn, the one that
Yes.
waxes exceeding great.
Oh, sorry, that's...
Alexander
yeah.
the Great, right?
I was missing that. I misstated that. I'm sorry. There's that horn, and then there's these 4 horns, and then there's this...
Little horn.
Yes, then there's this little horn. So that's what's there in Daniel 8. Right, and that is the parallel to the little horn of Daniel 7. Both little horns. And this is what it says, verses 9 and 10. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, that's where I was getting that phrase from, waxed exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and trampled upon them. Now in Daniel 7, who were the ones that the little horn trampled? The saints. So what are the saints called here in Daniel 8? They're called the host of heaven. They're called the stars, being trampled down to the ground. So what is taking place here is that there were those who had become sons of God, who are here being trampled down by the little horn, right? So this is all here in this prophecy of the 2300 days. So this 2300 days has something to do with this, and that's the investigative judgment, and Ezekiel forms part of the foundation for Revelation 4 and 5, right? So all these things are connected.
So
Then
continuously trample down these people so that they could never displace these gods.
right.
So they would always rule if they could never be, until they had a people that could be judged who could replace them. Okay.
Certainly.
Opens up a little window on the story.
Yeah, oh, certainly.
A little window.
Yeah.
Who would these people again? Just saints?
Yeah, these people, in the context of it, is those who were part of the original Yeshua movement, or, they were in Acts, they're referred to as the Netzarim. Paul, he was accused of being the ringleader of the sect of the Netzarim, or Nazarenes, and he affirmed that accusation as being true. And so it is those who originally followed Christ and were born again, and then this power, which was already working in Paul's day, begun to trample them down. And that,
The gospel away from them.
yeah, took the gospel away, removed them from being sons of God, some of them. Or if you look at it as a corporate body, the Netzarim joining this council, being on this council, and then being removed by being thrown back into sin, right? So that's what it is in the early centuries, is who it was in that particular verse. Now, in Ephesians chapter 2, it talks about, it says, starting from verse 1, "And although you were dead in trespasses and sins, wherein in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience, among whom also we all had our conversation, or our manner of life, in time past, in the lust of the flesh, the fulfilling of the desires, or the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. But God, who is rich in mercy, for his great love wherewith he loved us, even when we were dead in sins, hath quickened us together with Christ. By grace are ye saved. And hath raised us up together and made us sit together in heavenly places in Christ Jesus." So notice, it was, we were dead in trespasses and sins, and he saved us by grace through faith, which is justification by faith, to make us be able to sit in heavenly places.
So Christ is in that heavenly council, and we're looking to Christ.
Yes, he represents us in that heavenly council. Now, I'm going to read a connecting passage from...
We have to be quickened first.
Yes, we have to be quickened. And
We
that,
have to be born again.
yeah,
in order
that's
to
what
have
we're going to
voice
get to.
On
But
God's side, otherwise we're still under the dominion of the wicked gods, right?
yes, indeed. Yeah, so we're going to get into that. But first I want to read something from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I've read a couple times before.
You still need the screen?
No, actually, you know what? We can actually...
Want me to shut it off?
No. Actually, yeah, shut it off. You can shut it off. We won't need it anymore. Okay. So, this is from 4Q, which is Cave 4 at Qumran, document 181, fragment 1, F1, lines 3 and 4. So that's how they do things with the Dead Sea Scrolls references. This is what it says. "In accordance with the compassion of God, according to his goodness and the wonder of his glory, he approached some from among the children of this world, so that they can be counted with him in the council of the gods, as a holy congregation, in service of life everlasting, and in the lot of his holy ones. His wonderful mysteries, each man according to his lot, which he has signed to him, ... to life everlasting." In other words, that's a clear passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls talking about some of this world being made to become members of the divine council and to be, as a holy congregation, working the service of life, right? The service of life everlasting. Now that's the same thing that Paul's talking about when we are made to sit in heavenly places in Christ. We become members of the divine council, but that is only by being quickened, by being made alive, saved from death and trespasses and sins. Remember, this resurrection from death and trespasses and sins is what Romans 6 is about. And in Romans 6 it says, "Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey?" Right? So if we are serving sin, we are serving the wicked gods. If we are serving righteousness, we are serving the true. We're serving our heavenly family. Now, what is another symbol of that resurrection from death and trespasses and sins? Being born again, right? 1 John 3:1, when we are born again, that we may be called sons of God, sons of the living God, exactly. So who were the ones initially called the sons of God in the Old Testament? Well, it was those wicked gods, right? You read Job, you read all this. So we can be called sons of God by being adopted into the family of God, by being justified by faith, no longer serving their ways. That is how we become members of the Heavenly Council. So it's by becoming saved from sin that we become members of the Heavenly Council and displace these wicked gods. That's clear, right? That's pretty clear. Okay, so if that's true, being saved from sin, we need to know that that is the cleansing of the sanctuary, right? Because, and especially in the primary application for the living. The reason why is because the books of heaven record the deeds done on earth. And as we sin, we keep putting the record of our sins into the courts of heaven. So in order for the sanctuary to be cleansed, we need to stop putting our sins there. So in order for that to happen, we need ourselves to be cleansed, right? This is what Zechariah 3 is about, right? Joshua having the garment changed, have his iniquity to pass from him, so that he may have places to walk among those that stand by. He becomes a member of the heavenly council. That's what it's about.
Is the wave sheaf just members of the, and they would be the selectable ones on the heavenly council, but then the 144,000 rulers on earth?
The wave sheaf become members of the heavenly council. As far as we know, so do the 144,000. Beyond that, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. But what it's showing is this displacement, right? But that it's by being justified by faith. Zechariah 3 shows it so clearly that it's by his having his garments changed that he can become a member of that heavenly council, right? Have places to walk among these that stand by, those in the heavenly courtroom. So this whole scenario, it shows us that in order for those wicked gods to be displaced, that there must be the cleansing of God's people on earth. That is the cleansing represented by Ezekiel shaving his head in Ezekiel 5, right? Because Ezekiel, you read Ezekiel 4, right? And he was representing the house of Israel and Judah, right? What he was to eat is, he says, thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the heathen. So Ezekiel was representing God's people, right? So when Ezekiel shaved his head, it's the cleansing, the purification from sin of God's people, right?
Levitically speaking, the cleansing of the leper.
Exactly, the cleansing of the leper, a symbol of sin. And like you pointed out, those who despise prophesying are lepers. And so this whole thing, it's showing, okay, so Ezekiel 1, this throne comes down, and it's the message of, okay, there's going to be a displacement of these wicked gods and of the head god in the Babylonian system. You know, now the ones who are going to rule is going to be Yahweh and his people, Israel. And how do we become part of that people? By being born again, by being cleansed. That's the only way.
By choosing to serve our heavenly family.
By choosing to serve. Yes.
Through the truths delivered to us in Ezekiel 4.
Amen. Through the truths delivered to us in Ezekiel 4. Totally, totally. That is if accepted and received into the heart, of course.
Yeah.
So basically what happens is Ezekiel sees this Merkabah throne come down. And this one who's sitting on this throne says to him to sound a message of warning to God's people, right? So let's get this picture. It comes down, and this is clearly now we can see that Hadif was right in saying that this is a symbol of what is to be the beginning of the investigative judgment upon the living, right? Because that investigative judgment is that cleansing of the sanctuary, which is the making of people to being sons of God, which displaces the wicked gods, right? So it's this logical connection where, okay, he goes down, or this throne comes down. The one sitting on the throne gives this message of warning to Ezekiel. And at the end of this message of warning tells him to do an act that will portray something, at the end of which period is this cleansing, which would be the thing which would make people sons of God, to fulfill even that thing of Ezekiel 1, of Yahweh and having Israel as his sons by creation and by adoption. And so here the picture is that he's saying, okay, so now I'm coming down, and this is a symbol of where things are going. This is a symbol of me having rulership over the nations again, a symbol of Yahweh ruling over the council, and of you guys, the children of Israel, being that council and displacing these wicked gods. But in order for that to take place, there's got to be a cleansing, because you guys are bad off, as described in Ezekiel 8 and elsewhere, Ezekiel 5 as well. So need to just continue a little bit, but don't forget what you're saying. So, but first, you guys need to be cleansed. You're bad off. Here is something to identify when that cleansing begins. That's Ezekiel 4. It's saying here you are among Babylon. You're scattered in this Babylonian captivity. Jerusalem has become amalgamated with Babylon, which was manifested in the Roman Catholic Church, which was the antitypical Babylonian captivity after the destruction of the antitypical Solomon's Temple, which was the early Christian church, or the Netzarim movement. Netzarim means branches. A branch in a family tree is a son. They were the sons of God, the Netzarim of Yahweh, you know. And so that, it's saying, okay, after this, while you're in this Babylonian captivity, you go through these 430 years. You'll eat your defiled bread, and there's all the lessons there that Hodaf talked about in connection with that, at the end of which there's to be a cleansing. And that cleansing goes in stages, and it's not immediate, and you'll still be in iniquity, and that's what Ezekiel 5 shows. But the end result, when you keep going in Ezekiel, is that there will be a pure people that will receive this resurrection to life from the Spirit, breathing life into the dry bones, Ezekiel 37, who is the Spirit riding the throne in Ezekiel 1, you know, and that end result will be a mighty army, a mighty army going back to the land of their fathers, getting inheritance over the nations. That's the message of Ezekiel. That's the context. That's why, and this, in the written form, it will be a lot more detailed, but that kind of paints the picture. So go ahead.
A clarification. So, Brother Hodaf gave the indication that the 6 grains of Ezekiel 4, and they were 8 foot down, we know that.
Yeah.
Then the interpretation was the 7th message would not be polluted. And I've always wondered, well, what it was.
Yeah, exactly.
But that represents the cleansing. The cleansing began, but it's in stages.
Yes.
So it's still polluted until it reaches.
Yeah, it's still polluted, but it will, like Hodaf's message, same thing happened. It had the same sort of pollution. The branch message, it had the same sort of pollution. And there is a distinction between the man's dung and the cow's dung. Man's dung represents private interpretation. Cow's dung represents something altogether different, which it's still dung, it has similarities, but this is what Doug's study, Holy Cow, Holy Dung, is about the difference between the man's dung and the cow's dung, and how those represented by Ezekiel represent the faithful. They represent the faithful, and they refused to eat the man's dung. They refused to have the private interpretations. But they inevitably would have this cow's dung. A cow, symbol of the heifer, symbol of young cow, 2 sheep, the Spirit, right? The Spirit is that cow, and the dung of the Spirit is that thing in inspiration, which is the part of inspiration or the inspired truths which must be passed off. In other words, there is things that we learn even through the messages of inspiration that, and Doug gave the examples of, the Millerite understanding of the 2300 days and the ending at the second coming. Well, they had to give that up. They knew that it wasn't the second coming. Ellen White, she was among the last of the Adventists to believe that Sabbath started and ended at 6 o'clock, right? But that had to be passed off. These are understandings that were there intermingled with the messages of inspiration that were part of the common understanding of the day that were misconceptions. And these things had to be passed off. And so that's the symbol of the cow's dung in Ezekiel. And those things aren't necessarily, there's a difference between them and private interpretation. One is that they're just the common understanding. It's not someone promoting something as a message. And the other is that private interpretation works contrary to the message of present truth. None of these things in the cow's dung ever work contrary to the message of present truth, because they're only there during the message of present truth as part of the common understanding. In other words, it's just simply the principle that our Heavenly Family simply can't, for our own sakes, show us everything at once. And so we automatically will have all these other things connected with it.
Did
So,
you get your question answered from earlier?
Yeah, so just, I think you're saying this is all preparatory or preceding that loud cry then?
yes, yes.
Because that gives the legal right then to go back to the land.
Well,
And then,
yeah, as far as, here's the thing, there is the battle with the wicked gods and their nations continues through the loud cry and into that period of the setting of the kingdom. But the initial thing, the first to go is the Assyrian. He has to flee from land, and whichever god it is that rules the Assyrian is the first to lose his dominion. Now,
okay, and then
yeah,
the rest.
the rest follow.
Yeah.
And this, it's important to understand that because Revelation 19 does show that. The warring against the Lamb and the saints and, against God's people and God's city. Gog and Magog is another thing that shows that. By the time that Gog and Magog battle happens, the kingdom is already established, but there's still some god and some nation that dares to come against Yahweh and their kingdom. So these things, yeah, Hadaf refers to Turkey. That's true. So, there are things connected with this that we haven't gone through that I have in my notes here. And then there's other things which will be part of the study in written form that will go through this in a lot more detail. But I hope that shows that the Davidian and Branch understanding of Ezekiel, chapter 4 and 5, is not just something superimposed onto Ezekiel, but that this is the message of Ezekiel, and that this is by revelation that we're understanding these things, not by private interpretation and throwing it onto the scriptures.
May we also say the regular Adventist understanding of the cleansing of the sanctuary
Yes.
is now fully understood.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. And what this shows too, by the way, notice how, remember, Revelation, or I'll say Ezekiel 4, is part of the vision of Ezekiel 1. Daniel 7, which is the basis for Daniel 8, and Revelation 4, they are built on Ezekiel 1. They are built on that vision. So here's the thing. If Ezekiel 4 is part of that vision of Ezekiel 1, which undoubtedly now we can see it is, and that is the thing upon which Daniel 8 and Revelation 4 are built, and that's the cleansing of the sanctuary. Those are these 2,300 days, and it's built on the foundation of Ezekiel 4. And Ezekiel 4 gives us each day for a year. And it's a prophecy of years bringing us to this judgment upon the living. Then how could Daniel 8 have its prophecy not be in years, which is pointing to the judgment upon the dead? So it is 2,300 years based off that foundation. And we won't be able to get into it now, but I hope to write at some point there's a lot more reason why Daniel 8:14 is referring to 2,300 years and why it must absolutely end in 1844. That it can't be, in its final application, it cannot be something to take place just as literal days in the last days, or as literal days anciently. It actually cannot be, even if we didn't go through all the stuff that we went through today, that can be proven just by Daniel's prophecy itself, not going anywhere else. But this lays a further foundation for the Adventist connection of Ezekiel 4 with the 2,300 days.
That will be very timely because there is a popular ministry at the moment.
Yeah.
Who is pointing to the 2,300 days.
Right.
Literal application in our time.
Right. Oh yeah, there's many that apply it in that way, but there are a number of reasons why it simply cannot be. It simply can't be. So, and one of the reasons for that, I'll just mention this real briefly in case you wanted to write it down. Daniel 8 is in one place in verse 13 called the vision concerning the daily, right? The taking away of the daily is the beginning of the 1335 and the other time prophecies in Daniel 12, right? Now it's also mentioned in Daniel 11 verse 31 is the taking away of the daily. But when you go through Daniel 11, the time of the end is not even mentioned and does not even begin until verse 40. Therefore, the taking of, Daniel 11 verse 31 is the taking away of the daily. Verse 35 actually references the time of the end as being yet future from verse 35. And then verse 40 is at the time of the end. That's significant because that shows that the daily is taken away before the time of the end, right? So if it was taken away during the time of the end, that's contrary to Daniel 11. And if people want to say that the 1335 begins with the taking away of the daily and ends with the resurrection, which is what lots of people say, the problem with that is then the time of the end must necessarily be shorter than 1335 days, because the daily is taken away before the time of the end, and that's the beginning of the 1335. And if they're going to say the resurrection is the end of the 1335, then the last days and the time of the end must be less than a couple years. And the other issue with that is then that would also say that we're not in the time of the end, and therefore we can't understand the prophecies because they're only opened up in the time of the end, Daniel 12:4. So that interpretation is self-defeating. It cuts off the branch upon which one sits, because by the very interpretation, it cannot be understood now. But yet you're trying to explain it, so it's kind of, that's just one example of the flaw in the reasoning. But anyways, that kind of completes the overview of this. Are we good? Makes sense?
Hallelujah.
I think. Hallelujah. Thank you, Heavenly Family. Yes, let's pray and then we'll close off here. Okay. Heavenly family, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Amen.
It is wonderful, really. It is truly wonderful how you do things, and how each new moon you always bring something new to us. And I want to thank you for bringing it to us, but I also want to thank you for the reality of the things that we're talking about, and how you are resurrecting an army to displace the wicked gods who currently rule this world in such an unrighteous manner. We want to see the end of suffering. We want to see the end of violence and lies and wickedness and hate. And we know that you are doing this now, and it is glorious to be able to behold these things. And more than that, it is glorious to have the privilege and the opportunity of being part of your council. So we want to ask, dear brother, that you place this little group here, that you make mention of us in the council, that we may be all represented in you there. And I want to ask that each one here can be saved from sin, can be quickened, can have that garment change so that they may have places to walk among those that stand by. So, Heavenly Family, it's a glorious thing, it's a wonderful thing, and we are blessed to be here at this time of purification, this time when the dry bones are being raised. So thank you so much. You're absolutely beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Father, Mother. In the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.